Imagine capturing every moment leading up to something you never saw coming. A secret recording, a chilling figure, and a death that no one expected. What's worse, the truth is trapped in the shadows, hidden from the world. Stay with us as we unravel the mystery, because nothing is ever as it seems. You won't believe how it ends. Don't blink, or you might miss it. The man sat still, his hand steady on the camera. The room was dim, shadows playing across the cracked walls. He could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Every second felt like a weight pressing down. The only light came from a flickering bulb overhead, casting eerie shapes. Outside, the rain beat against the windows, a constant rhythm. He adjusted the camera lens slightly. The air was thick with tension, almost suffocating. His breath was shallow, quick. He watched the door, waiting. A faint creak, then silence again. His hands were clammy. Sweat trickled down his temple. His fingers tightened on the camera. He had been preparing for this moment for days. Weeks, even. The plan was perfect. Every detail accounted for. He focused the lens again, adjusting the angle. A shadow passed outside the door. His heart skipped a beat. It was time. His throat went dry as he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps. The man didn't dare move. His eyes locked on the door. It opened. A figure stepped inside. Tall, imposing. The man's pulse quickened. The figure didn't speak. He moved with an unsettling calmness. The camera captured every movement, every second. The man's hands trembled slightly. But he couldn't stop now. Not when everything was so close. He held his breath as the figure approached him. The tension in the air was thick, like it was about to snap. And then it did. The figure stopped in front of him. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat. A cold sweat covered his skin. And then the figure spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You think you can get away with this?" The man didn't answer. He just kept filming. Every moment was etched into the lens. The seconds stretched into eternity. And then, without warning, the figure lunged. A sharp, agonizing scream echoed in the room. The camera shook, capturing the chaos. The man's grip tightened. But it was too late. The camera caught it all. Every horrible detail. Every breath. Every move. The darkness closed in. And the last thing the man saw before the lens went black was the figure standing over him. The figure stood over him, unmoving. The man's vision blurred. His chest tightened, each breath coming slower. The camera lay on the floor, its lens cracked, but still recording. A low hum echoed from the camera's failing battery. The figure looked down at him with a chilling calmness. The man's mouth opened, but no sound came. His body felt heavy, paralyzed. The air around him was thick, suffocating. Blood pooled beneath him, warm and sticky. The figure bent down, crouching beside him. A cold hand brushed against his cheek. He could feel the life draining from his body. A strange sense of clarity washed over him. This was it, his last moment. But the figure wasn't done. He leaned closer, his breath hot against the man's ear. "You thought you could control everything," the figure murmured. "But it's never that simple, is it?" The man's eyes flickered to the camera. It was still recording, still capturing every moment. His hands twitched, the last of his strength slipping away. The camera's red light blinked faintly. The figure's shadow loomed over him, towering and dark. The man could barely hear his own heartbeat now. Just the sound of the figure's footsteps. Steady. Unhurried. The camera's lens slowly cracked more, distorting the image. But it kept recording. The man's thoughts were fading, slipping into the darkness. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body wouldn't obey. The weight of his own decisions pressed down on him. The figure stood again, and the room seemed to grow colder. The camera blinked one last time before going silent. The final moments, the final images frozen forever. The figure walked away, leaving the man in the shadows. All that remained was the silence, the ticking of the clock, and the distant sound of rain. The silence was unbearable. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on endlessly. The room felt colder, the air heavy with a presence that lingered. The man's body lay still, a dark figure in the dim light. Outside, the rain continued its endless rhythm. But inside, the world had stopped. The camera, still lying on the floor, captured only the emptiness now. Its lens cracked, the red light no longer blinking. The faint hum of the failing battery was the only sound left. In the shadows, the figure had vanished.
Gone.
But the moment hadn't ended. The man's vision was fading, the world around him blurring into nothingness. He could still hear the figure's voice, echoing in his mind. You thought you could control everything. The words played over and over, haunting him. The weight of it all, the planning, the execution, the fear, was too much. His body ached, every breath a struggle. And yet, a strange peace settled over him. The camera would tell the story. It had captured everything. The truth, the horror, the moment of finality. The room felt smaller now. The shadows seemed to grow, wrapping around him, swallowing him whole. He wanted to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The darkness closed in tighter, smothering him. The weight of his own actions finally hit him with full force. There would be no escaping it. The camera had captured it all. The truth. The moment when everything had changed. And yet, there would be no one left to see it. No one left to witness the end. The man's vision blurred one final time. And with a final, shuddering breath, everything went black. The room was silent now. No more breathing. No more movement. Just the sound of the rain, beating against the windows. The camera lay in the darkness, still recording, but without purpose. The man's body, lifeless on the floor, told a story no one would hear. Time passed, slow and endless. Minutes turned to hours. The rain continued, indifferent. Then, a faint sound, a creak from the door. Someone had entered. Footsteps echoed through the room, steady and deliberate. The figure reappeared. But this time it was different. The figure moved toward the man's body, crouching beside him. There was no fear, no hesitation. Only a cold, calculated calmness. The figure reached down, touching the camera. The lens was cracked, distorted. But it still functioned. The figure held it up, inspecting it. The man's final moments, captured forever. A soft chuckle broke the silence. The figure whispered, almost to himself, "Perfect." With a slow, deliberate motion, the figure turned off the camera. Then he stood, and without a second glance at the man, left the room. The door clicked shut behind him. The camera lay in the silence once more. And outside, the rain kept falling. Unaware, unforgiving. The story was over now, but the truth was still buried. The camera sat in the silence, its lens cracked but still capable of seeing the room. But no one was there to watch it. The rain continued to beat against the windows, relentless and cold. The man's body, lifeless and still, lay in the middle of the room. The world outside moved on, unaware of what had just unfolded. Time passed, seconds turning into minutes, then hours. No one came. No one noticed. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening as the night stretched on. And then the door creaked again. This time, it wasn't the same figure. Someone else had arrived.
A man.
He entered slowly, his eyes scanning the room. His footsteps faltered as he saw the body, the stillness of it. He moved toward the man's body, his eyes wide in shock. The camera still lay on the floor, the red light flickering faintly. The newcomer knelt down beside the man, checking for a pulse. But there was nothing. He swore under his breath. The air felt thick with something unspeakable. He stood, his eyes darting nervously to the camera. The footage was still there, still recording, capturing every second of the horror. The man glanced toward the door, then back to the camera. Without a word, he reached down and picked it up. His fingers trembled as he inspected it, his face contorted with unease. He couldn't understand what he was seeing. The silence was deafening now, the weight of the room pressing down on him. He backed away slowly, still holding the camera. The door closed softly behind him. The room was empty once more. The camera, now recording only emptiness, continued to capture the world no one would ever see. And outside, the rain fell harder. The rain had turned into a storm, relentless and fierce. The sound of it crashing against the windows filled the room, drowning out everything else. The camera sat on the floor, recording the emptiness, capturing the space that had once held so much tension. But now, there was nothing left. The figure was gone. The man was gone. The newcomer had left, taking with him a part of the story, but leaving the rest behind. The darkness in the room seemed to grow deeper, the shadows swallowing up every corner. The air felt heavy, as though the very walls were holding their breath. And then, just when it seemed as if the room would never be disturbed again, a small sound echoed. A rustle, faint at first, but growing louder. The camera had caught it, its lens slightly tilted, focused on the empty space. A figure stepped into the frame. It was hard to make out at first, the shadows too thick, the room too dark. But then the figure came closer, stepping into the dim light of the flickering bulb. It was a woman. Her face was calm, almost emotionless, as she surveyed the room. Her eyes locked onto the camera, and for a moment, everything froze. The camera continued to record, capturing her every move, her every breath. She walked toward the man's body, her footsteps soft but purposeful. She kneeled down beside him, her fingers brushing against his cold skin. Her expression didn't change. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't afraid. It was as if this was the moment she had been waiting for. She glanced around the room, taking in the broken walls, the cracked floor, the camera still recording. She reached out, her hand hovering over the camera, before she pressed the button to turn it off. The room fell silent once more. The rain, the only sound left, pounded against the windows in the darkness. And the truth, captured in the final moments of the camera's lens, remained a secret. The woman stood up, her eyes lingering on the lifeless body before her. She didn't look away, not even as the darkness of the room seemed to close in around her. The camera, now off, sat in the stillness. She stepped back, her boots barely making a sound on the floor. Every movement deliberate. Her eyes scanned the room, as if trying to remember something important. She walked toward the door, but hesitated for just a moment. A flicker of something in her eyes, uncertainty, or maybe recognition. She turned her head slightly, looking one last time at the man on the floor. Then, with a final, heavy breath, she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind her. Silence once again ruled the room. The camera, still sitting on the floor, captured only emptiness. Outside, the storm raged on, its fury now matched by the stillness inside. Minutes passed, then hours. But no one came. No one noticed. The man's death, the events that had unfolded, all faded into the shadows. The room, once filled with tension and life, now lay abandoned. Yet the camera still held the truth. It had captured everything, the terror, the coldness, the inevitable end. But it would never be seen. The world outside continued its endless march, unaware of what had transpired within those walls. The rain never stopped. It was as though the storm, the room, the camera had all become part of a forgotten story. And that story, buried in the shadows, would remain untold. A secret locked away in time, never to be uncovered. The storm outside continued its wrath, relentless and unforgiving. But inside, the room was still. The shadows were thick, stretching across every corner, swallowing up the last traces of life. The man's body, now cold, remained in the center of it all. The camera, still untouched, lay forgotten on the floor, its lens cracked, capturing nothing but the silence. No one came to disturb it. The darkness hung in the air, as if it, too, had become a part of the room. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the horrors contained within. But here, in this forgotten space, there was nothing left but the cold, empty truth. And then, without warning, a faint sound echoed through the stillness. A soft scrape against the floor. It was the camera. Somehow, it had been nudged. Its cracked lens reflected the dim light, catching the faintest glimpse of movement in the room. But there was no one there. Only the shadows. The camera's lens twitched slightly, the red light flickering weakly, as though fighting to stay on. It zoomed in, focusing on the empty space where the man had once been. A low hum filled the room as the battery struggled to stay alive. And then, as if something unseen had taken control, the camera moved. Slowly, deliberately. It turned toward the door, its lens focused on the now closed entrance. The quiet was suffocating. The room, still holding its secrets, seemed to breathe with anticipation. Something or someone was out there. The camera's red light blinked one last time. And then, with a sudden jolt, it fell silent. The room returned to its natural stillness. But now, in the deep silence of the night, the truth remained hidden. The camera, recording its final moments, was lost to the darkness. The room was silent again. The camera lay still, its lens reflecting only the dim light that barely reached the corners of the room. The storm outside seemed to rage even harder now, its winds howling through the cracks in the windows. Inside, the air was cold, as though the storm had seeped through the walls, filling the space with an oppressive chill. The man's body, still lying motionless, felt like a part of the room itself, frozen in time, forgotten by the world. Nothing stirred, nothing moved, and yet there was something unsettling about the stillness. As though someone was waiting. The camera, dead now, sat abandoned on the floor. Its final moments captured only shadows and silence. But in the deep recesses of the room, where the light could not reach, a whisper seemed to stir. It was faint at first, a soft rustle, like the shifting of fabric. It echoed from the darkness, where the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. The room, suffocating under its own weight, seemed to pulse with an unseen force. The whispers grew louder, just beyond the edge of hearing. The walls seemed to creak under the strain of it, bending and groaning as though the very space itself was alive. And then, a faint sound, barely perceptible, echoed through the room. A breath. A breath that wasn't the man's. It was slow, deliberate, and it filled the room with a deep, unsettling presence. The camera, though still off, seemed to vibrate with the energy that had taken hold of the space. And then, with the sound of the storm outside roaring louder than ever, something moved in the darkness. Something more than just the shadows. Something that could not be seen but could be felt. And for the first time, the room seemed to breathe. The room, heavy with the pulse of unseen movement, seemed to close in on itself. The storm outside raged louder, but inside, there was only a deep, suffocating silence. The camera, still lifeless on the floor, captured nothing but the shadows. But something had changed. A presence. It hovered in the air, just on the edge of perception. For a moment, nothing moved. The man's body remained frozen, unmoving, as if it were a part of the darkness. The air was thick, and then, a flicker of movement. A shadow darted across the wall, too fast to catch, too quick to see. The sound of breathing, unnatural, heavy, echoed in the room as if coming from every direction at once. It felt cold now, colder than it had ever been. The walls seemed to pulse, the room itself alive with an energy that hadn't been there before. And then, from the far corner, something emerged. It was a figure, tall, indistinct, like a shadow with no form. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it knew the room was its domain. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping so rapidly that the breath in the room was visible. The figure moved toward the camera, its presence almost suffocating. Every step it took seemed to make the shadows grow darker, more tangible. The camera, now powered back on as if by some unseen force, captured the figure's movements. Its red light flickered erratically, reflecting the tension that had settled over the room. The figure approached the body of the man, crouching down beside him. It didn't touch him. It only stared. And then, without warning, it straightened up, turning away from the lifeless form. The room seemed to hold its breath again. The figure moved toward the door. But as it reached for the handle, it paused. It looked back, its presence lingering in the darkness. For a long moment, the room was still. Then, the door slowly creaked open. And as the figure stepped into the hallway, the darkness of the room seemed to follow. The camera still recording captured it all. The last flicker of red as the camera died. And the silence returned. The storm outside had finally started to subside, the rain now a mere drizzle against the windows. The room, however, remained frozen in time. The camera, now completely lifeless, lay in the corner, its red light long gone. There was nothing left to capture. The darkness had fully taken hold of the space, its weight pressing down, suffocating everything. The figure, the presence that had once filled the room, had gone. The door, still slightly ajar, creaked in the breeze that had begun to stir outside. But the room remained eerily still. The man's body, untouched, lay just as it had been. It was almost as if nothing had changed, almost as if the horror, the chaos, had never existed. Yet, deep in the heart of the room, the silence spoke louder than anything else. There was a quiet finality in it, an acceptance that whatever had occurred here was now sealed away, buried beneath the weight of the shadows. The darkness, once filled with movement and breath, now seemed to calm, settling into a strange peace. Outside, the storm had passed, the clouds parting to reveal a faint glimmer of moonlight. The world was still unaware, untouched by what had transpired. And as the night stretched on, the room fell into a deeper, more complete silence. Time, too, seemed to stop, holding its breath as if waiting for something that would never come. And the camera, once a witness to the final moments, had stopped recording. Now, it too had become a forgotten part of the room, lost to the shadows and the stillness. Whatever secrets it had held, whatever truths it had captured, were now locked away forever. The door was still open, but there was no one left to walk through it. The storm had passed, and the world moved on. But here, in this room, the story had ended. And it would remain buried, a secret known only to the silence.